We already divided everything, my aunt declared with a cold smile. You weren't invited for a reason. The estate lawyer shuffled through his papers uncomfortably, then looked up with a frown. I'm afraid there's been a serious misunderstanding, Mrs. Whitmore. According to this will, Jasmine's name is the only one listed as beneficiary. The mahogany-paneled conference room fell into a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. My name is Jasmine Rivers, and at 32 years old, I never imagined I'd become the center of a family hurricane that would tear apart everything I thought I knew about the people who raised me. When my beloved grandmother Cordelia passed away 3 weeks ago after her battle with Alzheimer's, I discovered through a mistakenly forwarded email that I had been deliberately excluded from the reading of her will in the prestigious law offices of Mitchell and Associates in downtown Portland. The knot in my stomach had been growing for days as I wrestled with whether to show up uninvited to what should have been a family gathering. But something deep inside me, perhaps Grandma Cordelia's voice whispering courage into my soul, told me I belonged there, regardless of what my relatives thought. If you've ever felt like the black sheep of your family or been excluded from important moments that should have included you, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Family drama transcends borders and cultures, and I'm about to share how mine unfolded in ways that no one, especially not me, could have predicted. The law office of Mitchell and Associates occupied the 15th floor of the gleaming Riverside Tower, overlooking the Willamette River. As the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, I was immediately confronted by the sight of my extended family clustered in the marble-floored waiting area like a murder of crows dressed in expensive black attire. My Aunt Beatrice Whitmore spotted me first. Her perfectly styled silver hair didn't move as she whipped her head around, and her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the flash of fury in her steel-gray eyes. She had always been the self-appointed matriarch of our family since her marriage to my grandmother's eldest son, my Uncle Theodore. Jasmine, she said, her voice carrying across the reception area like a judge's gavel. What are you doing here? The conversations around the room ceased instantly. My Uncle Theodore, impeccably dressed in his $1,000 suit, rose from his leather chair with the bearing of a corporate executive who was used to commanding rooms. My cousins Penelope and Sebastian turned to stare at me with expressions that ranged from surprise to barely concealed hostility. Even my great-aunt Millicent, Grandma Cordelia's younger sister, looked away awkwardly rather than meet my eyes. The woman who used to sneak me extra cookies during family dinners now acted as though I were a stranger who had wandered into the wrong building. I'm here for Grandma Cordelia's will reading, I said, lifting my chin slightly despite the tremor I could hear in my own voice. I had chosen my outfit carefully that morning, a simple black dress that Grandma had always complimented, paired with the vintage pearl earrings she had given me for my college graduation. I wanted to look respectful, not desperate. Uncle Theodore stepped forward, positioning himself between me and the rest of the family like a human barrier. At 6'3", he had always used his height to intimidate, and today was no exception. You weren't invited, Jasmine, he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he used in his corporate boardroom. There's been a family discussion, and we've already handled the distribution of Mother's assets among the appropriate parties. Appropriate parties? I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. I'm her granddaughter. Aunt Beatrice let out a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. Oh, my dear girl, you're being dramatic. We already divided everything. Mother's jewelry went to Penelope, the antiques to Sebastian, the investment portfolio to Theodore, and the properties had been distributed according to what she would have wanted. My cousin Penelope, 28 and fresh from her MBA program at Wharton, smirked from her position near the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was wearing what I recognized as Grandma Cordelia's emerald bracelet, the one that had belonged to my great-great-grandmother and was supposedly being saved for special occasions. It's nothing personal, Jasmine, Penelope said, examining her manicured nails with studied indifference. But you have to understand the practical aspects. You're a social worker making, what, $40,000 a year? You wouldn't know how to properly manage real estate investments or handle the tax implications of significant assets. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. Sebastian nodded in agreement, adjusting his designer glasses. As the family's youngest heir at 26, he had always been groomed to take over Uncle Theodore's import business. Mother always said she wanted her legacy preserved and grown, not squandered on charitable impulses. The casual cruelty of their words hit me like physical blows. These were people I had shared Christmas mornings with, family members who had attended my high school graduation and college send-off parties. Now they were discussing me as though I were some distant acquaintance who couldn't be trusted with pocket change. But before I could formulate a response, the inner office door opened, and a distinguished gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes appeared. "Good afternoon," he said, consulting the leather portfolio in his hands. "I'm David Mitchell, senior partner. We're ready to begin the reading of Cordelia Elizabeth Rivers' last will and testament. If everyone could please come into the conference room." Aunt Beatrice stepped forward with her most charming smile, the one she reserved for people she considered important. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Jasmine here wasn't supposed to be included in today's proceedings. We've already discussed the estate distribution as a family." Mr. Mitchell's expression shifted from polite professionalism to genuine confusion. He opened his portfolio and consulted the documents inside, running his finger down what appeared to be a list of names. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Whitmore, but according to Mrs. Rivers' explicit instructions, Ms. Jasmine Rivers was to be present for this reading. In fact..." He paused, double-checking his papers with the thoroughness of someone who never made clerical errors. Her instructions were quite specific that the will should not be read unless Ms. Rivers was present. The color drained from Uncle Theodore's face. "That's impossible. Mother discussed her wishes with us extensively. She was very clear about her intentions." "Perhaps we should move to the conference room," Mr. Mitchell suggested diplomatically, "and address any confusion there." As we filed into the richly appointed conference room with its massive oak table and leather-bound law books lining the walls, I could feel the weight of my family's stares like physical pressure against my back. I took a seat near the door, partly because it was the only chair available and partly because some instinct told me I might need to make a quick exit. The room that had felt spacious moments before now seemed to shrink around us, filled with tension so thick it was almost visible. Uncle Theodore sat rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched tight. Aunt Beatrice kept shooting glances between me and Mr. Mitchell as though she could telepathically convince him to ask me to leave. My cousins whispered to each other in voices just low enough that I couldn't make out their words, but their body language screamed disapproval. Mr. Mitchell took his place at the head of the table and opened the official-looking document with ceremonial precision. The papers rustled in the silence like autumn leaves. "Before we begin," he said, looking around the table to make eye contact with each family member, "I want to note that Mrs. Rivers was very specific about her wishes. She spent considerable time ensuring that her will reflected her exact intentions, and she was of completely sound mind when these documents were finalized." And that's when he delivered the words that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandmother, and my place in both their hearts and their history. Growing up as the daughter of Grandma Cordelia's youngest child, my mother Diana Rivers, meant living in a world of contradictions. While the rest of the Rivers family built their empire in luxury imports and real estate investments, my mother chose a different path entirely. She was a passionate environmental lawyer who dedicated her career to protecting Oregon's coastal wetlands, often taking on cases that paid very little but meant everything to the communities she served. My father, Michael Rivers, no relation to the family name, just a coincidence that amused Grandma Cordelia to no end, was a high school history teacher at Roosevelt High in the Hawthorne district. He had a gift for making the past come alive for teenagers who thought history was boring, often staying late to help struggling students or organizing field trips to local historical sites on his own dime. While Uncle Theodore's family lived in their sprawling mansion in the exclusive Dunthorpe neighborhood, complete with a circular driveway and manicured gardens maintained by a full-time landscaping crew, we lived in a cozy craftsman-style house in the Laurelhurst area. Our yard was a beautiful chaos of my mother's vegetable garden, my father's fruit trees, and the reading nook he had built me in the old oak tree. Every Sunday after church, we would drive to Grandma Cordelia's Victorian estate on Prospect Drive in the West Hills, a magnificent 3-story house that had been in our family since 1923. The house was Grandma's pride and joy, filled with antiques, family photographs spanning generations, and the lingering scent of her signature lavender potpourri that she made from flowers grown in her conservatory. Those Sunday afternoons were magical. While Uncle Theodore's family would arrive in their black Mercedes, spend exactly 90 minutes making polite conversation about stock portfolios and country club gossip, then leave promptly to attend some social obligation, my parents and I would stay for hours. Grandma Cordelia and I would spend time in her kitchen, a warm space with copper pots hanging from wrought iron hooks and herb gardens growing on every windowsill. She taught me to make her famous blackberry scones using wild berries we picked from the bushes behind her house, and her legendary beef bourguignon that took all day but filled the house with the most incredible aroma. Cooking is love made visible, Jasmine, she would tell me as we worked side by side, flour dusting our aprons. Anyone can buy an expensive meal, but when you put your heart into feeding someone, that's when you create real nourishment. Her philosophy extended far beyond the kitchen. Grandma Cordelia had inherited significant wealth from her late husband, my grandfather William Rivers, who had built a successful import business before his death when I was 7. But unlike Uncle Theodore, who saw the business as a money-generating machine to be constantly optimized, Grandma believed wealth came with responsibility. She quietly donated to homeless shelters, funded scholarships for underprivileged students, and every Thanksgiving, our family would spend the morning serving meals at the Blanchett House downtown before returning home for our own feast. Uncle Theodore's family never joined these excursions, claiming they were too busy with prior commitments. When I turned 16 and expressed interest in social work, inspired by volunteering at a local youth center, my extended family's reaction was swift and predictable. At that year's Christmas dinner, Uncle Theodore cornered me near the towering Fraser fir tree that dominated Grandma's living room. "Jasmine, you're a bright girl," he said, swirling his expensive bourbon while studying me with calculating eyes. "You could work for the family business. I could start you in our international acquisitions department, travel the world, make real money, build a future with substance." He gestured toward Sebastian, who was then 18 and already interning at the company during his summer breaks from prep school. "Your cousin understands the value of legacy. This business has supported our family for 3 generations. You could be part of something bigger than yourself." I glanced across the room at my parents, who were deep in conversation with Grandma about a local conservation project. My mother was animated, her hands moving expressively as she described the legal challenges facing the Tillamook Bay estuary. My father was listening intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he genuinely cared about her work. "Thank you, Uncle Theodore," I said carefully, "but I want to help people who don't have advantages. I want to work with families in crisis, kids who need advocates, elderly people who might be forgotten." He set down his glass with more force than necessary. "That's very noble, Jasmine, but nobility doesn't pay for retirement or build wealth for the next generation. Your grandmother could make a phone call tomorrow and set you up with opportunities that most people can only dream about." "But I want to earn my own way," I replied, echoing words my parents had taught me since childhood. Uncle Theodore's expression hardened slightly. "That's the kind of thinking that keeps people poor, Jasmine. Smart people leverage their advantages." That conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with my extended family. At future gatherings, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift. Where once my cousins had included me in their conversations about college plans and career aspirations, now they spoke around me, as though my choices had somehow made me irrelevant to their world. Penelope, who was 3 years older and studying business at Stanford, would make pointed comments about people who waste opportunities. Sebastian, despite being younger than me, began treating me with a condescending politeness usually reserved for distant relatives or family friends. The divide became even more pronounced when I decided to attend Portland State University for my social work degree instead of accepting the partial scholarship I had been offered to University of Oregon's business program. At my high school graduation party, held in our backyard under string lights my father had hung between the trees, I overheard Aunt Beatrice talking to another family member. "It's such a shame," she said, her voice carrying the particular tone adults use when they think teenagers can't hear them. "Diana and Michael have filled that girl's head with such impractical ideas. She could have had a real career, but instead she'll spend her life dealing with other people's problems for pennies." The comment stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. During my 4 years at Portland State, I threw myself into my studies and fieldwork. I interned at the Multnomah County Department of Human Services, volunteered at the Transition Project's homeless shelter, and spent my junior year working with at-risk youth at the Morrison Child and Family Services Center. Each experience reinforced my belief that meaningful work didn't have to be measured by salary figures or stock options. I was making a difference in real people's lives, helping families navigate crisis, advocating for children in difficult situations, and connecting elderly clients with resources they needed to maintain their independence and dignity. Throughout my college years, Grandma Cordelia remained my strongest supporter. While the rest of the family gradually distanced themselves from what they saw as my misguided career choice, she would call me every Wednesday evening to check on my studies and hear about my fieldwork experiences. "Tell me about your week, sweetheart," she would say, and I knew she genuinely wanted to hear every detail. When I described helping a single mother secure housing assistance or connecting an elderly veteran with healthcare benefits, Grandma would listen with the same attention Uncle Theodore reserved for quarterly profit reports. "You're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing," she assured me during one particularly difficult semester when I was questioning whether I could handle the emotional weight of social work. "The world needs people like you, Jasmine. People who see individuals instead of statistics." After graduation, I was hired full-time at Morrison Child and Family Services, where I specialized in elder care advocacy. My caseload included seniors who needed help navigating Medicare, families dealing with aging parents who required additional support, and elderly individuals who had no family advocates at all. The work was challenging and sometimes heartbreaking, but it was also incredibly rewarding. I helped reunite a veteran with benefits he had been denied for years, assisted a grandmother in gaining custody of her grandchildren when their parents couldn't care for them, and connected isolated seniors with community programs that brought friendship and purpose back into their lives. My salary was modest. Uncle Theodore hadn't been wrong about the financial realities of social work, but I lived comfortably in a small apartment in the Selwood neighborhood, drove my reliable but aging Honda Civic, and found joy in simple pleasures like farmers market visits and hiking in the Columbia River Gorge. The family gatherings became increasingly uncomfortable as the years passed. At holiday dinners, conversation would inevitably turn to business successes, real estate acquisitions, and investment strategies. When anyone asked about my work, their polite interest lasted exactly long enough for basic courtesy before the subject shifted to more interesting topics like Penelope's promotion to senior analyst or Sebastian's acceptance to the executive MBA program at Northwestern. But Grandma Cordelia always made sure I felt valued and heard. She would ask detailed questions about my cases, celebrate my successes, and offer comfort when I faced particularly difficult situations. During family photos, she would make sure I was positioned prominently, not relegated to the edge of the group as my aunts and uncles preferred. 3 years ago, when I was 29, the family dynamics shifted dramatically during what would later become known as the Lake House incident. Grandma owned a beautiful property on Clear Lake in the Cascade Mountains, a rustic but charming cabin where our family had spent summers for decades. Uncle Theodore called an urgent family meeting to discuss practical concerns about the property. When I arrived at Grandma's house that evening, I found not just family members waiting in the living room, but also a real estate agent with a briefcase full of documents and a contractor with renovation estimates. The message was clear: they had already decided to sell the lake house, and this meeting was merely a formality. But they hadn't counted on Grandma Cordelia's fierce independence or her long memory of summers spent at that lake with Grandpa William, watching their children learn to swim in the clear mountain water, and later teaching grandchildren to fish from the old wooden dock. When she quietly but firmly refused to sell, the family's reaction revealed exactly where their priorities lay. And that's when I began to understand that the growing distance between me and my relatives wasn't really about career choices or lifestyle differences. It was about who we were at our core, and what we valued when we thought no one important was watching. As the seasons turned and Grandma Cordelia entered her 80s, subtle changes began to appear in our family dynamics that would eventually explode into open warfare. What started as occasional disagreements about her independence gradually escalated into a systematic campaign to control every aspect of her life, and to eliminate my influence entirely. The first warning sign came during a family barbecue at Uncle Theodore's house in the summer of 2021. I had arrived with a container of Grandma's favorite potato salad, made from her own recipe that she had taught me years earlier. As I set it on the elegant granite countertop in their gourmet kitchen, I overheard Aunt Beatrice speaking in hushed tones to her neighbor, Mrs. Pemberton from the country club. "Cordelia is becoming quite dependent on Jasmine," she said, stirring her martini with manicured fingers. "We're concerned about the influence. You know how elderly people can become vulnerable to manipulation, especially when someone spends so much time with them." My hands froze over the serving spoon. Manipulation? I had been visiting Grandma twice a week for years, bringing groceries, helping with household tasks, and simply spending time together because we enjoyed each other's company. The idea that my genuine love and care could be twisted into something sinister left me speechless. Mrs. Pemberton made sympathetic noises. "Oh, you must be so worried. I've heard stories about family members taking advantage of older relatives. Have you considered involving Adult Protective Services?" "We're monitoring the situation closely," Aunt Beatrice replied with the tone of someone discussing a business problem rather than a beloved family member. "Theodore has some ideas about how to handle things if they get out of hand." I slipped away before they noticed me listening, but the conversation planted a seed of unease that would grow exponentially in the coming months. At the barbecue, I watched my family with new eyes, noticing subtle patterns I had somehow missed before. Uncle Theodore spent most of his time on his phone, handling business calls even during family gatherings. When he did interact with Grandma, his conversations focused heavily on practical matters, her health insurance, property taxes, investment performance. He showed little interest in her stories about the neighborhood book club or her excitement about the new bird species visiting her garden. Penelope and Sebastian, now established in their careers, treated Grandma with the polite attention usually reserved for elderly relatives you see twice a year. They would kiss her cheek upon arrival, make obligatory inquiries about her health, then spend the remainder of the visit discussing their own achievements and acquisitions with their parents. Only I seemed to notice that Grandma barely touched her food that day, or that she kept losing track of conversations mid-sentence. When I quietly asked if she was feeling all right, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Just a little tired, dear. Too much excitement for one day." But Uncle Theodore had overheard. "Mother's fine," he said sharply. "She's just adjusting to some new medications. Her doctor says it's completely normal." I wanted to ask what medications, what doctor, and why I hadn't been told about any health changes, but the warning look in Uncle Theodore's eyes made me swallow my questions. This was the first time I realized that information about Grandma's well-being was being filtered through gatekeepers who apparently didn't consider me worthy of inclusion. The control began slowly and subtly. In September, Aunt Beatrice announced that she had hired a housekeeper for Grandma, a stern woman named Mrs. Hoffman who would come 3 times a week to ensure proper maintenance of the property. When I arrived for my usual Tuesday visit, I found Mrs. Hoffman reorganizing Grandma's kitchen with military precision. The cupboards were a disaster, she informed me without any pleasantries. Mrs. Rivers clearly needs more structure in her daily routine. Grandma sat at her kitchen table looking lost in her own home as Mrs. Hoffman relocated items to what she deemed more logical locations. The herbs and spices Grandma used for our weekly baking sessions were locked away in a high cabinet, supposedly for safety reasons. The comfortable chaos that had made the kitchen feel warm and lived in was replaced by sterile organization that prioritized efficiency over comfort. "I can't find anything anymore," Grandma confided to me later when Mrs. Hoffman had left. "She moved my mother's mixing bowls to a shelf I can't reach, and she threw away my recipe cards because they were cluttered and outdated." The recipe cards had been handwritten by Grandma's mother and grandmother, irreplaceable family treasures that contained not just ingredients but memories spanning generations. When I called Aunt Beatrice to express concern, her response was dismissive. "Mother needs to adapt to more practical systems," she said. "Mrs. Hoffman is a professional. She knows what's best for elderly clients." October brought the installation of a medical alert system that required Grandma to wear a pendant around her neck at all times. While the safety aspect made sense, the device came with a monitoring service that required Uncle Theodore as the primary contact. Suddenly, every minor incident, a dropped plate, a momentary dizzy spell, an accidental activation of the panic button, generated detailed reports that were shared with the family. Every report painted Grandma as increasingly fragile and incapable, despite my observations that she remained sharp, engaged, and physically capable of managing her daily activities. When I questioned the necessity of such intensive monitoring, Sebastian explained it to me as though I were a child. "Jasmine, you don't understand the liability issues involved in elder care. If something happens to grandmother and we haven't taken proper precautions, there could be serious legal and financial consequences." Legal and financial consequences. Not concern for Grandma's well-being or quality of life, but protection of the family's interests. The language revealed everything about their true priorities. November brought the most significant escalation yet. Uncle Theodore announced that he had consulted with Grandma's physician about her declining cognitive function, and had been advised to implement a structured visiting schedule to reduce confusion and overstimulation. The new schedule allocated specific time slots to different family members. Uncle Theodore received Sunday afternoons for important business discussions. Aunt Beatrice was assigned Wednesday mornings for household management oversight. Penelope and Sebastian were given rotating Saturday visits for social interaction. I was assigned 2 hours on Thursday evenings, from 4 to 6 p.m., with the stipulation that visits focus on light companionship rather than complex activities that might cause agitation. Complex activities apparently included cooking together, working in the garden, or looking through old photo albums, all the things Grandma and I had always enjoyed doing together. When I protested that this schedule would eliminate our most meaningful shared experiences, Uncle Theodore's response was swift and cold. "Jasmine, you need to understand that Mother's needs have changed. The family has discussed this extensively with her medical team, and we've determined that overstimulation is contributing to her confusion." "What confusion?" I demanded. "She seems perfectly clear to me." "That's exactly the problem," Aunt Beatrice interjected. "You don't have the training or objectivity to assess her condition properly. You're too emotionally involved to see the decline that's obvious to the rest of us." The gaslighting was masterful. They were simultaneously claiming that I spent too much time with Grandma to have proper perspective and that I didn't understand her condition well enough to have valid input into her care decisions. But the most devastating blow came during our first scheduled visit under the new system. When I arrived promptly at 4 p.m. on Thursday, I found cousin Sebastian already there, along with a woman I didn't recognize who introduced herself as Amanda Crawford, a geriatric care manager. "We're just finishing up an assessment," Sebastian explained, not meeting my eyes. "Miss Crawford is helping us develop a comprehensive care plan for grandmother." I watched from the doorway as this stranger asked Grandma basic questions designed to test cognitive function. "What year is it? Who is the current president? Can you name your grandchildren?" Grandma answered correctly but seemed uncomfortable with the clinical nature of the interaction. When Miss Crawford left, I had only 90 minutes remaining of my allocated visit time. Grandma seemed tired and somewhat disoriented after what felt more like an interrogation than a friendly conversation. "I don't like these strangers coming to my house," she told me quietly as we sat in her sunroom watching birds at the feeder. "They make me feel like I'm failing some kind of test." "You're not failing anything," I assured her, taking her hand in mine. "You're sharp as ever." She looked at me with eyes that held more clarity than anyone was giving her credit for. "Jasmine, I need you to know something important. No matter what anyone else says, no matter what papers they show you or decisions they claim I've made, you are the one who truly knows me. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Her words carried a weight that I didn't fully understand at the time, but they lodged in my heart like a protective talisman against the storm that was coming. By December, the family's campaign against me had moved beyond scheduling restrictions to active exclusion. I learned about Grandma's doctor's appointment not from any family member, but from Mrs. Hoffman, who mentioned in passing that she would need to reschedule her cleaning day to accommodate the visit. When I called Uncle Theodore to ask about the appointment, his tone was icy. "Mother's medical care is being handled by the family, Jasmine. Your involvement isn't necessary." "I'm part of this family," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. "Because your behavior lately suggests someone who's more interested in what Mother can do for you than what's best for her health and well-being." The accusation was so unfair, so contrary to everything I had tried to be for Grandma, that it literally took my breath away. Before I could respond, he continued. We've all noticed how you've isolated Mother from the rest of the family, how you've encouraged her dependence on you specifically. It's concerning, Jasmine. And if it continues, we may need to take more serious steps to protect her. The threat was unmistakable, even wrapped in the language of concern and family welfare. I was being painted as the problem, the dangerous influence that needed to be eliminated for Grandma's own good. That Christmas, I wasn't invited to the family gathering at Uncle Theodore's house. I received a text from Penelope explaining that they were keeping things small this year, due to concerns about Grandma's stamina. Through social media posts, I discovered that small meant everyone except me. I spent Christmas Eve creating a photo album of memories from my years with Grandma, pictures of us baking, gardening, attending community theater productions, feeding ducks at Laurelhurst Park. Each image told the story of a genuine relationship built on love, respect, and mutual enjoyment of each other's company. On Christmas morning, I drove to Grandma's house with the photo album and a tin of the blackberry scones we used to make together. Mrs. Hoffman answered the door with obvious reluctance. The family left specific instructions that Mrs. Rivers wasn't to be disturbed today, she said, blocking the doorway like a security guard. I'm family too, I replied, holding up the tin of scones. I just want to wish her Merry Christmas. Through the living room window, I could see Grandma sitting alone in her favorite chair, still in her nightgown at noon, staring out at her garden with an expression of profound sadness. She looked smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with isolation from the people and activities that had given her joy. Mrs. Hoffman followed my gaze and her expression softened slightly. She's been asking about you, she admitted quietly. But Mr. Theodore said it would be too confusing for her to have visitors today. I left the scones and photo album with Mrs. Hoffman, along with a note telling Grandma how much I loved her and that I would find a way to see her soon. As I walked back to my car, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was done playing by their rules. If they wanted to treat this like a war, then I would fight for the woman who had been more than a grandmother to me. She had been my guide, my champion, and my dearest friend. The battle lines were drawn, and I had no intention of surrendering without a fight. The reading of Grandma Cordelia's will began with standard legal language that seemed to stretch on forever, each formal phrase building tension in the already charged atmosphere of the conference room. Mr. Mitchell's voice was steady and professional as he worked through the preliminary sections, but I could feel my family's growing impatience radiating from across the mahogany table. Uncle Theodore drummed his fingers silently against his leather portfolio, a habit I recognized from childhood that indicated his irritation was reaching dangerous levels. Aunt Beatrice maintained her composure, but I noticed her jaw was clenched so tightly that the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. Penelope kept checking her phone discreetly, as though this legal proceeding was merely an inconvenience interrupting her important schedule. Then Mr. Mitchell reached the section that changed everything. After careful consideration and extensive observation of my family members over recent years, I have made the following decisions regarding the distribution of my estate, he read, his voice taking on a more somber tone. To my son Theodore Rivers and his wife Beatrice, who have repeatedly pressured me to liquidate assets for their convenience and have shown more interest in my financial portfolio than my personal well-being, I leave the sum of $1 each, along with my hope that they will learn to value relationships over real estate. Uncle Theodore shot to his feet so quickly that his chair rolled backward and struck the wall with a sharp crack. That's impossible, he sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. Mother would never, there has to be some mistake. Mr. Mitchell continued reading without pausing, his professional demeanor unshaken by the outburst. To my granddaughter Penelope Rivers Whitmore, who wore my grandmother's diamond bracelet to a charity auction without permission and has consistently treated family heirlooms as personal accessories, I leave my collection of costume jewelry, which should suit her preference for appearance over authenticity. Penelope's gasp was audible across the room. She instinctively touched the spot on her wrist where she habitually wore expensive jewelry, her face going pale as the implications sank in. To my grandson Sebastian Rivers, who has spent the past 3 years pressuring me to sell my beloved lake house for practical financial reasons, I leave my collection of fishing equipment and outdoor gear, with the hope that he might someday understand that some things have value beyond their market price. Sebastian was shaking his head in disbelief, his carefully styled hair falling across his forehead as he leaned forward in his chair. "This can't be legal," he whispered. "Grandmother wasn't in her right mind. Those assessments, the care manager's reports, they all documented cognitive decline." But Mr. Mitchell was far from finished. "To my sister Millicent, who abandoned our weekly bridge games and stopped visiting when my health began to decline, I leave my complete set of bridge playing cards and the hope that she will remember the importance of loyalty in her remaining years." Great Aunt Millicent began crying softly, her previous composure crumbling as she realized the full scope of what was happening. She had clearly expected to inherit Grandma's substantial jewelry collection or perhaps a portion of the real estate holdings. And to the rest of my extended family members who treated my final years as an inconvenient prologue to their inheritance, Mr. Mitchell continued, "I leave my gratitude for showing me exactly where their priorities lay when they thought I was no longer paying attention." The silence in the room was deafening. Even the traffic noise from the street 15 floors below seemed to have stopped, as though the entire city was holding its breath for what would come next. "The remainder of my estate," Mr. Mitchell read, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence, "including my primary residence at 847 Prospect Drive, my lake house property at Clear Lake, all financial accounts, investment portfolios, personal belongings, and family heirlooms, I leave entirely to my granddaughter Jasmine Rivers, who alone among my family members loved me for who I was rather than what I possessed." The explosion of voices was immediate and cacophonous. Uncle Theodore was shouting about undue influence and legal challenges. Aunt Beatrice was demanding to see documentation of Grandma's mental competency. Penelope was sobbing dramatically while Sebastian paced behind his chair like a caged animal. Through the chaos, I sat frozen in my seat, unable to process what I had just heard. Everything? Grandma had left me everything? The Victorian house with its 3 stories of memories, the lake property where we had spent countless summer afternoons, the financial security that would allow me to continue my social work without worrying about rent or student loans. But more than the material inheritance, she had given me something far more precious: validation. After months of being gaslit and marginalized by my own family, Grandma had seen the truth clearly and acted to protect it. Mr. Mitchell raised his voice to restore order. "There's more," he announced, causing the room to fall silent once again. Mrs. Rivers anticipated that her decisions might be challenged, and she took extensive precautions to ensure her wishes would be honored. He opened a second folder and withdrew a stack of documents that seemed impossibly thick. Over the past 18 months, Mrs. Rivers underwent comprehensive cognitive evaluations by 3 independent neurologists, all of whom certified her as mentally competent to make these decisions. She also documented her reasoning extensively. Uncle Theodore's attorney leaned forward, his earlier confidence clearly shaken. "We'll need to review all medical documentation and assess the validity of those evaluations. There are established protocols for challenging wills when there are questions about testamentary capacity." "Of course," Mr. Mitchell replied smoothly. "However, you should also be aware that Mrs. Rivers installed a comprehensive security system in her home 2 years ago. The system documented all visitors, recorded conversations in common areas, and maintained detailed logs of who came and went from the property." The color drained completely from Aunt Beatrice's face. I could practically see her mental calculations as she tried to remember every conversation she had conducted within range of potential recording devices. Mr. Mitchell wasn't finished. Mrs. Rivers also maintained detailed written records of family interactions, including dates, times, and specific conversations. She documented instances of property being removed from her home without permission, financial pressure tactics, and attempts to isolate her from family members she wished to see. Sebastian found his voice first. "You're talking about an elderly woman who was clearly paranoid and suspicious of her own family. That doesn't sound like someone of sound mind to me." "On the contrary," Mr. Mitchell replied, opening yet another folder. Mrs. Rivers was methodical and thorough. She provided me with an inventory of missing items, complete with photographs and documentation of their current locations. She saved text messages, emails, and voicemails that demonstrated patterns of manipulation and coercion. He placed a photograph on the table that showed Penelope wearing Grandma's emerald bracelet at what appeared to be a formal event. Another photo showed a distinctive antique clock that I recognized from Grandma's hallway, now sitting prominently in Uncle Theodore's office. Mrs. Rivers was particularly concerned about items being removed from her home under the guise of safekeeping, Mr. Mitchell continued. She documented 17 separate instances of valuable objects disappearing after family visits, only to reappear in relatives' homes or offices. Aunt Beatrice finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak. Those were gifts. Cordelia gave us those things willingly. Do you have documentation of these gifts? Mr. Mitchell asked politely. Because Mrs. Rivers certainly documented her surprise at discovering their absence. The trap had been perfectly laid and expertly executed. Grandma hadn't just written a will, she had constructed an ironclad case that would withstand any legal challenge. Every conversation, every manipulation, every instance of elder abuse had been carefully recorded and preserved. Uncle Theodore was frantically whispering with his attorney, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the full scope of the evidence became clear. It was obvious that what they had assumed would be a routine estate distribution had turned into a potential criminal matter. There's one final element, Mr. Mitchell said, reaching into his briefcase to withdraw a sealed envelope. Mrs. Rivers prepared a personal message for Ms. Jasmine Rivers, to be read privately. However, she also prepared statements for each family member, which she requested be read aloud. He opened a different envelope and began to read in Grandma's own words, "To Theodore, my eldest son, I leave you a lesson I should have taught you years ago. Wealth without character is meaningless, and power without compassion is destructive. You transformed our family business into a machine for generating money rather than supporting people. You treated my final years as an inconvenient delay before claiming your inheritance. I hope someday you understand the difference between being rich and being worthy." Uncle Theodore's face had gone from purple to gray, and I worried briefly that he might be having a heart attack. The words cut deeper than any financial loss could have, striking at the core of his self-image as the family patriarch and successful businessman. "To Beatrice," Mr. Mitchell continued, "you spent 3 years trying to convince me that I was incompetent while simultaneously plotting to gain control of my assets. Your campaign to isolate me from Jasmine revealed more about your character than you intended. I hope you find the peace that has clearly eluded you throughout your pursuit of social status." Aunt Beatrice was no longer crying, she sat rigid in her chair, staring straight ahead as though she could will herself invisible. The statements for Penelope and Sebastian were equally devastating, each one demonstrating that Grandma had seen through their manipulations and understood exactly what they were trying to achieve. She had been playing chess while they thought they were playing checkers. As Mr. Mitchell finished reading, the legal and emotional implications settled over the room like a heavy blanket. My family sat in various states of shock, grief, and rage, confronting the reality that their carefully orchestrated plan had not only failed but had been anticipated and documented every step of the way. The inheritance was mine, protected by an overwhelming mountain of evidence that would make any legal challenge not just futile but potentially criminal. But as I looked around the table at the devastated faces of people I had once loved and respected, I realized that Grandma's greatest gift wasn't the money or property. She had given me the truth, preserved in her own words and actions, proving that I hadn't been crazy or paranoid or manipulative. I had been the only one who truly saw her as a person deserving of love and respect, and she had recognized that love for exactly what it was. The war was over before it had really begun, won by a woman who had spent her final months ensuring that justice would prevail even after her death. The weeks following the will reading felt like living in the aftermath of an earthquake. The legal aftershocks continued for months, each one revealing new layers of the dysfunction that had been festering beneath my family's polished surface. Uncle Theodore made good on his threat to contest the will, hiring one of Portland's most expensive estate attorneys and filing papers claiming undue influence, diminished capacity, and fraudulent manipulation. His legal challenge lasted exactly 6 weeks. When Mr. Mitchell presented Grandma's extensive documentation to the court, the medical evaluations, the recorded conversations, the detailed inventory of missing items, and the security footage showing family members removing objects from her home, Uncle Theodore's attorney advised him to withdraw the case immediately to avoid potential criminal charges for elder abuse and theft. The judge's written decision was scathing. She noted that Cordelia Rivers had demonstrated extraordinary foresight and mental acuity in documenting family behavior, and that the evidence presented painted a clear picture of systematic financial and emotional exploitation by family members who were more concerned with inheritance than inheritance. But the legal victory felt hollow when measured against the complete destruction of family relationships. Within days of the failed court challenge, I received a certified letter from Uncle Theodore's attorney demanding the return of all family photographs, documents, and personal items in my possession. The letter was written in the coldest possible legal language, treating me like a stranger who had somehow gained illegitimate access to family property. Aunt Beatrice's response was even more dramatic. She organized what she called a family intervention, inviting distant relatives and family friends to a meeting at her country club to discuss my manipulation of Grandma Cordelia. According to my cousin Rachel, Uncle Theodore's daughter who had moved to Seattle years earlier and maintained some independence from the family drama, the meeting was a disaster. Mother stood up in front of 30 people and basically accused you of elder abuse, Rachel told me during a phone call that felt like a lifeline in the ocean of hostility surrounding me. She had charts and timelines showing when you started visiting grandmother more frequently, suggesting it was all part of some calculated plan to isolate her from the family. The irony was breathtaking. Aunt Beatrice was accusing me of the exact tactics that she and Uncle Theodore had employed, projecting their own manipulation onto my genuine relationship with Grandma. What did people say? I asked, dreading the answer but needing to know how completely my reputation had been destroyed. Honestly? Most people looked embarrassed for her, Rachel said. Mrs. Patterson from the garden club actually walked out halfway through. She said she remembered how devoted you were to grandmother and that Aunt Beatrice's accusations sounded like sour grapes from someone who lost an inheritance she thought she deserved. The community response was mixed but generally more supportive than I had expected. Grandma's longtime friends rallied around me, sharing stories of how she had spoken proudly about my work and our relationship. Dr. Martinez from the senior center where I had volunteered called to offer his support and to share that Grandma had often talked about my dedication to helping elderly clients in my professional work. But the professional consequences were severe and immediate. Aunt Beatrice's campaign extended beyond social circles into my workplace. She contacted the administration at Morrison Child and Family Services, making veiled suggestions about my concerning behavior patterns, and questioning whether someone who could manipulate an elderly relative should be trusted with vulnerable clients. My supervisor, Linda Chen, called me into her office on a gray February morning that matched my mood perfectly. Jasmine, I need to ask you directly about these allegations, she said, her usually warm demeanor replaced by professional caution. We've received multiple calls suggesting that you exploited your relationship with your grandmother for financial gain. The conversation was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life. Here was a woman who had known me for years, who had praised my dedication and skill countless times, now forced to question my fundamental integrity because of my family's smear campaign. Linda, everything they're claiming is the opposite of what actually happened, I said, struggling to maintain my composure. I loved my grandmother. I spent time with her because I enjoyed her company, not because I wanted her money. I believe you, Linda said quietly, but the board is concerned about liability issues. If there's even a possibility that these allegations have merit, it could affect our licensing and reputation. The result was a forced leave of absence while the agency conducted an internal investigation. For 6 weeks, I sat in my small apartment while investigators interviewed my former colleagues, reviewed my case files, and examined my professional conduct for any signs of the manipulative behavior my family alleged. The investigation ultimately cleared me completely, but the damage to my professional relationships was significant. Several colleagues who had once been friends now treated me with cautious politeness, as though they weren't quite sure what to believe. The rumors had spread throughout Portland's social services community, creating a cloud of suspicion that would follow me for months. During this period of professional exile, I spent countless hours in Grandma's house, my house now, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. Every room held memories of our time together, but they were now tainted by the knowledge of how those same memories had been twisted and weaponized against me. In her bedroom, I found a collection of journals I hadn't discovered during my initial exploration of the house. Unlike the detailed documentation she had kept for legal purposes, these were personal reflections spanning the final 3 years of her life. Reading them was like having one last conversation with her, hearing her voice in every carefully written word. One entry from 6 months before her death was particularly poignant. Jasmine brought me soup today when I mentioned feeling under the weather. She didn't ask about my medications or my doctor appointments or whether I had updated my will lately. She just wanted to make sure I was comfortable and had everything I needed. This is what love looks like: attention without agenda, care without calculation. Another entry revealed the depth of her awareness about family dynamics. Theodore visited today with some papers he wanted me to sign, something about streamlining estate management for tax purposes. When I asked to read them carefully before signing, he became impatient and said I was being unnecessarily complicated. Jasmine would never pressure me to sign documents I didn't understand. She trusts me to make my own decisions and supports whatever I choose. The journals painted a devastating picture of systematic manipulation by family members who saw Grandma as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than a person deserving respect and autonomy. But they also revealed her growing appreciation for my genuine care and the peace she found in our uncomplicated relationship. Reading her words helped heal some of the wounds inflicted by my family's accusations. I wasn't crazy or manipulative or calculating. I had simply loved an elderly woman who was being exploited by her own children, and she had recognized that love for what it was. The financial inheritance, while substantial, came with responsibilities I hadn't anticipated. Grandma's investment portfolio required active management, the Victorian house needed ongoing maintenance, and the lake property had become a source of both joy and burden. I spent weeks meeting with financial advisors, property managers, and tax attorneys, learning to navigate a world of wealth that felt foreign to my middle-class background. But I was determined to honor Grandma's values rather than simply preserve her assets. I established the Cordelia Rivers Foundation for Elder Advocacy, using a portion of the inheritance to fund programs that supported isolated seniors and provided legal advocacy for elderly people facing family exploitation. The foundation's mission statement came directly from Grandma's journals: every elderly person deserves to live their final years with dignity, respect, and the freedom to make their own choices about their care and their legacy. The Foundation's first major initiative was partnering with Adult Protective Services to provide trained advocates for seniors who showed signs of being financially or emotionally exploited by family members. We funded legal representation, counseling services, and safe housing options for elderly people who needed protection from relatives who saw them as financial opportunities rather than beloved family members. The work was emotionally difficult but deeply satisfying. Each case reminded me of Grandma's situation and motivated me to ensure that other elderly people wouldn't face the isolation and manipulation she had endured. The foundation also funded research into elder abuse patterns and developed educational materials to help seniors recognize and resist exploitation. 18 months after Grandma's death, I received an unexpected phone call from Penelope. Her voice was hesitant and uncertain, lacking the confident condescension that had characterized our previous interactions. "Jasmine, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear from me," she began, "but I wanted to apologize for everything that happened. I've been in therapy, trying to understand how our family became so toxic, and I realize now that we lost sight of what actually mattered." The conversation was awkward and painful, but also strangely healing. Penelope admitted that the family had been consumed by greed and entitlement, treating Grandma's final years as an inconvenient delay before claiming their inheritance. She acknowledged that their campaign against me had been cruel and unjustified. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, "but I wanted you to know that some of us realize we were wrong. Grandmother saw something in you that we were too selfish to recognize." Over the following months, other family members reached out with varying degrees of acknowledgement and apology. Sebastian sent a brief email expressing regret for his behavior. Great-Aunt Millicent called to share memories of Grandma and to admit that she had been influenced by Uncle Theodore's narrative rather than forming her own opinions. Uncle Theodore and Aunt Beatrice never contacted me directly, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that their marriage had become strained under the weight of their financial disappointment and social embarrassment. The inheritance they had counted on for their retirement and social status had vanished, leaving them to confront the reality of their true financial situation without Grandma's expected windfall. 2 years after the will reading, I stood in Grandma's garden on a warm spring afternoon, watching bees work among the lavender plants she had tended so carefully. The garden had become a place of peace and reflection, somewhere I could feel connected to her memory without the anger and pain that had dominated the months following her death. I had learned to navigate my new financial reality while staying true to the values she had instilled in me. The foundation was thriving, helping dozens of elderly people maintain their independence and dignity. My professional reputation had recovered completely, and I had returned to Morrison Child and Family Services with a renewed sense of purpose and a deeper understanding of family dynamics and exploitation. The house on Prospect Drive had become truly mine, filled with new memories while honoring the old ones. I had kept Grandma's favorite pieces of furniture and art while adding touches that reflected my own personality and lifestyle. The kitchen still smelled like lavender and vanilla, and I still baked her blackberry scones every Sunday, sharing them with friends and neighbors who appreciated both the recipe and the stories that came with it. The lake house remained a sanctuary where I could retreat from the demands of city life and remember the summers when Grandma taught me to fish and identify bird calls. I had begun inviting other families to use the property, particularly single parents and their children who couldn't afford vacation rentals but needed respite from urban stress. Standing in the garden that afternoon, I felt Grandma's presence in the gentle breeze that rustled the herb plants and the soft buzzing of bees among the flowers. She had given me more than property and financial security. She had provided a master class in recognizing authentic love, standing up for truth, and using privilege responsibly. The family war was over, but its lessons would stay with me forever. I had learned that wealth could corrupt even the closest relationships, that manipulation could masquerade as concern, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are actually the ones most willing to exploit that love for their own gain. But I had also learned that genuine care and respect are always recognizable to those who receive them, that truth has a way of prevailing even against coordinated deception, and that the most meaningful inheritance isn't money or property but the wisdom to use both in service of something larger than yourself. If you've ever found yourself caught in the middle of family conflict, or if you've watched greed destroy relationships that should have been built on love, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is witness each other's experiences and remind ourselves that we're not alone in navigating these difficult dynamics. Hit that subscribe button if this story resonated with you, and remember that the most valuable legacy you can leave or receive isn't material wealth, but the knowledge that you were truly seen, respected, and loved for exactly who you are. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Grandma Cordelia would be proud to know that her story is helping others recognize the difference between authentic love and calculated manipulation, and inspiring people to choose truth and compassion even when the cost seems impossibly high. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.